Of course, North Yorkshire, as you can see up there, it's a wonderful place to visit, by the way. I travelled to Whitby, which itself is a fantastic place to visit, and I went across the North Moors, and even though I was in a car, you can tell that it's incredibly beautiful. So if you ever get the chance to visit that part of the world, do so. Anyway, just to give you a bit of an overview before I get into the map. So what you have in AD 43, Romans have invaded, all that kind of thing going on, and obviously they're travelling northwards, and they get to this area or this region around AD 70 or thereabouts. And the main factional tribe that they're encountering in this region are called the Brigantes, and we'll see about those in a moment. I'm going to start with Malton, which is really quite an interesting place. So at Malton, you've got a few things that are going on. You can see these red dotted lines. Those are suspected Roman roads. The filled in red lines are known or discovered Roman roads. And obviously you've got York there to orientate yourself, because again, we're looking at everything to the north here. So at Malton, you've got three things that you can immediately notice. You've got that red square, which means there's a fort. You've got that rectangle, which means that there was a temporary camp or a marching camp. And then you've got that circle. And that circle effectively means there was a settlement there. And this seems to have been a vicus. And a vicus was a settlement that grew up around a fort and then became its own thing. The fort itself was quite an interesting one. Apparently it was a vexillation fort. And a vexillation fort was essentially where you have a detachment from another legion being based to do something. And this actually is a comment on the wider practice of the Roman army. So we might think of the Roman army as having legions, fine. Those legions were quite mobile, not only in terms of how they could move about, but also how they could take detachments, units from them, and they could go and do things in other places. And that happened quite a lot. It was part of the mobility of the Roman army. That's why it was so good at doing what it needed to do. And these were from the Gemina, the 14th Legion. And this was a legion that had been raised under Julius Caesar. It had been one of the legions which had been involved in the initial invasion of Britain. And here it seems to have been, well, perhaps it was keeping an eye on things, because this area around here, it had the Parisi tribe in it. The Parisi were fine. They didn't seem to mind Rome too much. You did have the Brigantes, and the Brigantes were the ones that the Romans did have some disagreements with, as you might imagine. So they were the ones that were going to cause any problems for Rome if they did. But it wasn't actually the Gemina that did predominantly the fighting. That seems to have been the 9th Legion, which were involved here as well. So again, you've got a lot of Roman army movements going on. And this actually extends further, because by around AD 70, Gemina, or the 14th, have moved back to Europe, because if you're an empire, it's spinning plates. You've always got something going on. You have to move forces and armies around. Rome was very good at that. That's why it was able to hold an empire as long as it did, because it could move men, logistics, that kind of a thing. Anyway, it won't bore you with all of that. And then if we were to go to the north, you can see we've got Cawthorne, and then we've got Leesrig. And these are those two sort of squares, red squares. The dotted line between Cawthorne and Leesrig obviously means there's a temporary road. Oh, sorry, not a temporary road. That means that there's a road that hasn't been discovered yet. So let's talk about those two briefly. You have these two auxiliary Roman forts that are connected to each other. One's Leesrig and the other is Cawthorne. At Cawthorne, there seems to have been several camps. I think there's 2 or 3 that have been suggested or unearthed there. And then you've got Leesrig. These are auxiliary forts. They're there because they need to be there. They date late 1st century AD, early 2nd century AD. I suspect that with Leesrig, because it's by the River Esk, there was a requirement for some control of that region. That's often where we find Roman forts, because they need to control an access point, a strategic point, so it's possible needing access to the river there, and perhaps it worked in tandem with Cawthorne. If we go back to Malton and then head west, we come across Hovingham. Hovingham is just below the Big E. And why this is interesting is because of something that I found while I was researching this whole area. And it was a stone coffin, which was found in 1616. And the stone coffin seems to have been the most northern Roman barrow. That is a type of burial in the UK. That itself is quite interesting. More interesting was the inscription found on the stone coffin. Now, sadly, the stone coffin just went missing. People have tried to find it in the 18th and 19th century with no luck. I suspect and hope it's in someone's back garden, and perhaps we'll find it. But the inscription on it was quite poignant, and I'll read it to you. To Titia Pinta, who lived 38 years, and to Valerius Adjutor, who lived 20 years, and to Valerius, who lived 15 years. Valerius Vindicanus had this set up to his wife and sons. So obviously this was an individual whose family sadly passed away, and he set up a stone coffin for them. Perhaps they were all interred in it. And unfortunately, because we don't have the coffin, we don't know what date this is, because we just have a reference to it in the inscription. But hopefully one day we'll find it and we'll know, we'll have a bit more details about it. But anyway, moving on next, and a bit cheerier, we can go to two final places. I'm this side because we're looking at Aldborough and Catterick. Now, in case you're trying to work out exactly where we are, you can make out Eborach, which is Roman York, just down there, so you have a rough idea of orientating yourself. So Israel Brigantium, or Aldborough, that seems to have been what was essentially the capital, if you can call it that, for the Brigantes. The Brigantes were contesting the area with the Romans, and it was the famous Ninth Legion who was doing all of the engaging here, or seems to have been. Still with me? Excellent. Here's your reward. A story about a tree. So if we take the northern road, we come to Catterick. This is a Roman fort. It's an auxiliary fort. It dates to around the AD 70s onwards. But the really notable thing here is what they found, that the Romans were seemingly trying to grow here. Walnut trees. Now, walnut trees are not indigenous to the UK, which means the Romans presumably were bringing them over and trying to grow them here, which I think is a really interesting insight into how Romans were trying to adapt Britain to their own ends and introducing things that perhaps hadn't been here before. But thanks again, and I've learnt a bit about North Yorkshire. I hope you're happy with what I managed to find.